I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by Be Secular. Be free to love, be able to choose, be accepted no matter your race, gender, sexual orientation, or belief system. Be Secular.
Be Secular merchandise allows you to display your support for equality and the separation of church and state, while also donating up to 50% of the profit from your purchase to nonprofits, groups, and artists that support those same values.
Go to www.besecular.com, pick your item, and then choose who you want to get a donation from your sale.
Listeners of this podcast will get a 10% discount if they use the promo code FRIENDLY. Make a statement. Be you. Be secular.
Monica Snyder is a representative from the group Secular Pro-Life, a group that seeks to unite pro-lifers regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. She's worked with the group since its inception in 2009, and you can learn more about it at secularprolife.org, all one word. For the sake of this conversation and simplicity, we're just going to use the terminology pro-life throughout the discussion.
Monica, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So how did you get involved in this organization? Like, what's your own history, both in terms of being pro-life and being an atheist?
So, well, first I want to clarify that I refer to myself as an agnostic. Some people think that matters and some don't.
Got it. So, my bad.
Okay. I actually got involved with this organization because I like to argue online, and a lot of people say that's
Join everybody.
Yeah, but I am essentially, when I first was able to get on Facebook, which I think was around like late 2006, I sort of unthinkingly really joined a couple different groups that had names of things I was interested in, and one of them was just called pro-life. And to be frank, up until that point in my life, I hadn't really looked into the issue that much. I was raised that way, and I'd just been pro-life my whole life. And then I joined this group, and one of my very first experiences in the group was to have pro-choice people challenge some of the things I said in very thoughtful ways. And I had never spoken to pro-choice people directly about it before. And it really got me thinking, and I found it very interesting, and I started getting on that group probably not literally every day, but a great deal for months, and talking to the same people about lots of different aspects of the debate.
And you're having good civil conversation debates about this issue. I'm surprised. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, I think it was because it was the same people, and you sort of, maybe this is different for different people, but we basically became friends. And we ended up sometimes getting bored talking about abortion, and we would talk about other things, and we got to know each other. And so it was easier for us to have useful conversations and to sort of approach each other with genuine questions and not just try to win, because there's not really any winning anyway. Anyway, I got to know pro-life people too, and one of them was Kelsey Hazard, who is the president of Secular Pro-Life. And when she decided to found the group, she reached out to people she knew were secular, including me, and asked if we'd like to be involved. And I sort of shrugged and said sure, because I thought it would basically entail what I'd been doing, which was arguing online. And then it ended up getting much bigger than I think either of us anticipated. And I found it to be completely fascinating work, and I actually struggle to have good boundaries when doing secular pro-life work to balance it out with the rest of my life, which needs attention too, because it's got all of this intersectionality to it, because you get to know all of these people coming from really, I refer to it as really non-traditional perspectives on the issue, and I'm trying to understand those different perspectives and help people communicate with each other about that.
Just really quick, you said this thing kind of got really big. How many people are we talking about? I don't know if that means membership in the organization or people on the Facebook page or something like that, but how far-reaching are you guys?
Well, the Facebook page right now is somewhere a bit over 6,000 followers. So when I say really big, I mean bigger than I thought it would ever be. Big enough that people are asking us to do college presentations. They're asking us to do speeches. You know, you asked me to come on this podcast. I never thought I would be doing anything beyond just having debates with people online, and now we have like this very active blog, and we've developed a website, so it's bigger than I anticipated, but compared to most pro-life groups, still relatively small, though.
Okay, so how does this get played? How does this play out when you're non-religious and you're pro-life? What does that mean for you in both of those worlds? Because I imagine the pro-life people are not happy with the non-religious side of you, and I know for a fact the non-religious people are not happy with the pro-life side. So where does that put you?
Yeah, you're correct. I find that the pro-life people that we work with, the Christians that we work with, they tend to be, I think, sort of surprised and confused, but in general, they just try to be accepting even if they don't necessarily get our position. But those are the ones that we work with directly. There's also a whole bunch of Christian pro-lifers that we don't necessarily work with that have varied reactions to us. And yeah, sometimes it can be kind of hostile or off-putting. And you've seen, like you said, that the pro-choice side, especially pro-choice atheists, more so than pro-choice Christians, tend to be very, very unhappy about our existence. I wouldn't say I enjoy that. I think it can be very frustrating because we're sort of between a rock and a hard spot with one group or the other dislikes one aspect of us. But I don't really see, for me personally, that can't keep me from doing what I'm doing because I can't make myself religious. I just don't. There are many facets of religion, as I understand it, that I just do not understand or agree with. So there's nothing. I don't feel like there's anything I can do about that, even if I wanted to. And I kind of feel the same way about the abortion debate. I have a lot of people I'm close to who are pro-choice since I started really digging into it, as I mentioned, and I understand that perspective much, much better than I used to, and I think I empathize with it much better than I used to, but there are certain aspects of it that at least I personally have a difficult time reconciling for myself. So to be blunt, it's frustrating, but I can't make myself religious and I can't make myself pro-choice, so I just kind of keep on keeping on.
So if I'm an atheist and I'm a feminist, why should I be pro-life? Like, why should I agree with you?
What's like your elevator pitch to make us pro-life?
Okay. So, just from my perspective, I look at it as a consistency issue. When I think about how I approach human rights for born people, I try to make sure I apply that consistency to people or humans or however you want to refer to it before we're born. And for me, I haven't been able to find a consistent standard that would exclude us as organisms before we're born and include us after. I think there's a lot of good reasons to feel differently about the preborn, but when I try to apply those consistently to all of humanity, I find myself thinking that if we use those reasons throughout, we end up excluding born groups of people that at least I personally think we should be careful to protect. So it's hard to talk about in 30 minutes, but just like as an example, I know a lot of pro-choice people feel that viability is a good sort of middle ground. Once the fetus is able to live, or at least has a good chance of living without requiring the mother's body, then that's a good place to say maybe after that we can restrict abortion, but before that we shouldn't. And I think that's a very pragmatic way to look at it. But in terms of sort of the ethical perspective, it doesn't make sense to me because depending on where you live or when you live, if you look throughout history, there are going to be different situations where an earlier fetus could be viable, like in the United States, that might not be in a third world country today, but that doesn't speak to whether or not it should have rights. I don't know if that makes sense. So I have a hard time seeing that as a consistent approach, even though I get the motivation behind it. So I guess in a nutshell what I'm saying is I think we should work harder to protect even preborn human life because I find that to be consistent with how we try to protect born human life.
Do you, for you, is there an important distinction between, so if I became pregnant and I didn't intend to, and I don't want to be pregnant, do you delineate that from I got pregnant and I have a medical condition and my life is put at risk, or my general good health is? Do you designate those two things?
Yeah, I think that is an important factor, and there's actually a lot of factors that will change the way the situation looks ethically. I think, in general, if any woman is pregnant and it's putting her health risk, or certainly it's putting her life at risk, that's a different kind of situation than if she's pregnant and doesn't want to be, but her life isn't threatened. I think it's a more dire situation, and I think especially if it comes to a life versus life, I think abortion has to be legal in those cases, because I frankly see it as self-defense. I don't think that we can require people to die for that. I mean, we don't even do that with born children.
Mm-hmm.
So there are situations when you would say, okay, you know what, abortion may be an option in this particular case, but there are a lot of factors that play into it.
Exactly. I actually think it's more complicated than a lot of people on both sides of the debate like to say that it is. I think that people, I don't want to put words in everyone else's mouth, but I find that there's such strong passions on both sides of this debate. There are people who basically see it as equivalent to killing newborns, and there are people that basically see it as enslaving women, and those are both very serious considerations. And I think a lot of people feel that if they grant any complexity or gray area, they're risking compromising those principles. And I empathize with that, but I think it's actually pretty complicated.
This is a true story. When I was in medical school for 1 year, and I was part of a pro-choice organization, and we had a national convention. And one of the sessions that they had there, and I just remember this one really vividly, the lady who was speaking, the doctor who was speaking, asked us all if all of you had these skills to perform an abortion, to perform the procedure, how many of you would do it in the first trimester? And I think all of us in the audience stood up and said we would do it. And then she said, how many of you would do it in the second trimester? And you had some people sit down. And then she said, how many of you would do it in the third trimester? And I think maybe in this room of 100 plus people, 2 people were still standing up. And the point she wanted to make is this is what happens every time she speaks to a pro-choice group. These are doctors who will be performing these procedures in the future, and even they are not very comfortable about doing it late into the pregnancy, which is kind of what Monica's you were saying about the viability issue. And that was kind of the problem that this speaker was talking about. We need doctors who are willing to do that. Which is a whole separate issue here. But yeah, it was fascinating to me that these are the most pro-choice people you will find. And even they're like, I don't think I'd feel comfortable doing it myself.
Well, and I think...
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Monica, I think you're absolutely right that this isn't a black and white issue. And I think all three of us can agree on that, a baby, a fetus that's at 9 months and a fetus that's at 5 days is a different story. But I think my issue with the pro-life thing, and I do think that a lot of us have the same goals. I think reducing abortion is almost always a good thing. But
there are a lot of atheists who will disagree with you even on that.
You're right. That's fair. But I think the reducing the need for abortion is, I think, what I should have said. The reducing the need for abortion. My feeling, and I completely. Absolutely, you are allowed to have an opinion, and you're allowed to say, if I accidentally get pregnant with a baby I don't want, I am going to keep it to term because that's what...
That was my decision.
That's my decision. That's what I want to do. I think my issue is that restricting abortion access rarely restricts abortions. It just promotes unsafe abortions.
Is that something secular pro-life does in terms of, at least I don't know if you guys take a policy stance on this, but do you try to restrict or push for legislation that would restrict access to abortion facilities?
So essentially we try to focus more on educational efforts and not as much on legislation. For example, we never endorse political candidates, and we try to focus on emphasizing the common ground between both religious and secular pro-lifers, and even at least some extent between pro-lifers and what I refer to as moderate pro-choicers, the ones that feel like we do, that reducing the need for abortion is crucial. So we tend to try to sort of focus away from the legislative side. But to answer more of the spirit of your question, in the long run, in the big picture, we do feel that the moral worth of the fetus would necessitate stricter laws on abortion. But there's also a lot of debate about whether that would be useful currently, or there's a lot of debate within the entire pro-life movement, not just with secular pro-life, about whether it makes more sense to work on hearts and minds, resources for women, understanding why this is happening and reducing all of that first before really hitting hard with the legal side, versus a lot of people in the pro-life movement think the legal thing needs to happen sort of first and foremost and immediately, otherwise we don't really mean what we're saying. And they focus on that more, and they think everything else can happen in its own time. And
Explain this to me.
Is much more the former.
Sure. Explain this to me, because I don't think I understand this. What, if you, and I say you as a big collective you, if pro-life people were able to restrict access to abortion facilities, because some states we know are shutting them down, maybe there's one left in the state, something like that.
Trap laws?
Yeah, that to me, and this is what Jessica was saying earlier, that to me wouldn't make people stop having abortions. It would just make it harder to get. And that to me just puts everybody in jeopardy. I don't understand whether you do it first or even last. It says to me that your educational push for why women should not have them, I don't know, trying to shut down the abortion facilities themselves would mean that you guys failed with the education aspect. So that, to me, that's where I kind of draw the line. Like, I'm fine with you guys trying to educate people on these issues.
Of course.
More power to you if it works and if you're right and if you could persuade people. But why shut down the facilities? And that's a general question. That's not specifically at you.
Well, I will say, I think most pro-life people that I know, and again, I'm talking about the general pro-life movement more so than our group specifically, they flatly don't believe that shutting down abortion facilities or making more restrictive laws, let me rephrase, they believe that will result in on-the-ground less abortions. And they seem to feel that the arguments that it will just result in unsafe abortions are sort of like these political arguments. There's a lot of disconnect between people on your side of the fence, what you're trying to say and what they're hearing. And so they pursue these measures anyway because they really think that that's going to overall reduce abortion. And also, I'm sure you're aware that other methods of reducing abortions, like increased access to contraception, increased sex education, which secular pro-life agrees will help reduce abortions and should also be easy, like common ground. Many other pro-life groups take issues with that because they believe differently about that too. A lot of them think that increased contraception will counterintuitively actually increase abortions by increasing risky sexual decisions. There's all sorts of different premises that they start with in their attempts to reduce abortion. So, but getting back more to secular pro-life specifically, I think that in general our idea is that we want to, like you guys were saying, we want to address why women are seeking abortion in the first place, especially the many women who, if they had more resources or more options, might not necessarily be inclined that way. I think everyone can agree that that's sort of a societal failure right there. But we also believe that fetal life, if you want to understand it from a pro-life perspective, it's kind of putting it crudely, but basically, imagine whatever you're saying, but apply it to newborns. And that's how pro-lifers hear it. So when you talk about, like, there's really no equivalent because that's not how America in general sees the abortion debate. But if you could imagine some horrific sci-fi scenario where we were regularly killing newborns, right? And then you talk to the people who are trying to make it illegal and say, but that won't lessen it, let's just only stick with education. Many people would feel that on a human rights level, that's not enough. Do you see what I'm saying? And so there's the pragmatic approach in terms of what actually works, which I totally get and in general agree with, but there's also a sort of principled approach where whether it works or not, we want to live in a society that legally recognizes the value of all humans. And that's a big part of it from the pro-life perspective.
Here's the thing, and with absolute due respect to you, Monica, I understand exactly what you mean. And I sincerely, I really, really do. I just don't give a shit. I don't, and this isn't directed at you at all, Monica. This isn't directed at you, but when you say oh, they believe that a three-week-old zygote is, I don't know if that's the right word. I shouldn't have pretended to use medical terms. A 3-week-old baby is the same, a 3-week-old fetus is the same as a 3-week-old baby. I understand that you're saying that's how they think. I just don't give a shit because they're wrong. It's not the same thing. And in my opinion, I just can't. This is a thing I very much care about.
And if this was just a matter of opinion, then okay, maybe not a big deal. But people's lives are at stake. Right. People's, their future lives, not just their medical lives.
Right.
So yeah, how do you deal with people who? I assume that's a response you get quite a bit. That there is a difference between this stuff. So how do you respond to that? I'll shut up there.
Well, I think for me personally, when I'm talking with people who are just not going to see eye to eye in terms of how we view the embryo or the fetus, then I prefer to focus on where we do have common ground, which almost everybody I talk to, even people who disagree with the safe, legal, and rare mantra because they think rare implies a values judgment. Pretty much everyone I talk to still agrees that we want to address why women are seeking these in the first place. Sure. And I think there's a lot of common ground there, and I do prefer to spend more time on that stuff, especially because the secular pro-life, as you mentioned before, kind of is working on two fronts here. We try to have communication with pro-choice secularists about why we see this the way we do, but we also spend a great deal of time talking to religious pro-lifers about, first of all, where secularists are coming from, and also about maybe what could help the movement be more effective. And so I prefer to focus on those things. If you don't agree, let's say that you feel absolutely nothing whatsoever about, an embryo or anything up until, say, viability, which is, like I said, a pretty common stance. That's fine. I think it's very difficult to persuade people otherwise without very long, protracted philosophical conversations, and that has happened.
Right. But
it's not common in my experience. But usually, even people who feel nothing about fetal life, they still feel something about women who say they're not getting enough support from their professional life, or they're coming from a very difficult relationship, or they didn't realize how to use birth control. Those are all problems anyway. Mm-hmm. Everyone agrees those are problems, and I'm happy to focus on that too. And we spend a lot of time trying to get other groups and people in the pro-life movement to also focus on those things and try to put more effort into that. So we sometimes, it's tricky. We're always trying to find common ground, but we do push for the contraception thing, which is always controversial in pro-life circles, and the sex education thing less often. And we also spend a lot of time, at least I do, trying to talk to the mainstream pro-life movement, what we call it, about how they come off to non-traditional groups, not just secularists, but also LGBT people, and sometimes we're starting to look into more about some of the racial issues and things like that, and talk to people about what they're saying and doing that they may not realize is very alienating to people who might otherwise agree with them. And so I find myself seriously, over half the time, not even talking about abortion, but actually about identity issues, which is also pretty interesting.
What's more important to you personally, trying to convince other non-religious people to move closer to the pro-life position, or trying to convince pro-life Christians that they need to do more to reach out to a broader group of people?
I focus more on the latter, I think, because I think it's more doable. Mm-hmm. In my experience, other secularists, not only do they not agree, which, that happens, but they tend to be, it's difficult to have a calm conversation about it because, at least from what we've experienced so far, they tend to be angry that we are even talking
that you exist.
We've had, we've had a lot of people accuse us of being secretly Christian. I assure you I am not. And just all sorts of things that I don't really know. I don't really know what to do with that. So I'll say what I think, and you disagree, and that's fine. Even on this podcast, it's sort of, I think what we all expected, and that's fine. But if it's going to be a very hostile, impossible conversation, I'd rather focus where people are more curious. And I find that at least the religious pro-lifers that we work with, they tend to be pretty curious, and they tend to really want to understand how they cannot be as alienating. One of the most fulfilling things is when I go to a conference, and these conferences are very religious, and I have people come to me like, what am I saying that would put you off? Like, what do I say and do that you think other atheists would sort of recoil from? And they have no idea. Some of them don't even know any other secularists at all.
Yeah.
So it gives me this weird venue to have this sort of separate conversation about religion and inclusiveness that I really enjoy if people are interested.
Have you been invited to a lot of religious pro-life gatherings? How many, maybe, have you or maybe someone from secular pro-life?
I would say that phrase is redundant. Yeah, more so all the time as more people hear about us. So the big thing was every January, as you probably know, there's a March for Life in Washington, D.C., and in the last 10 years or so, there's also a Walk for Life in San Francisco, and I live in California. Mm-hmm. And this last year, the people who put on the Walk for Life, which numbers, the attendees are somewhere in the order of magnitude of tens of thousands. They estimate between 40 or 60,000 last year and things like that. They actually asked me to do a speech for them, which was unheard of for secular pro-life. Mm-hmm. And once I did that, it got us a lot of exposure. So this year, we've actually had a lot more people asking us. I know you saw the youth rally thing I did a couple weeks ago in Bakersfield. And
yeah, you gave a speech to a big crowd there that was primarily religious.
Yes, and the youngest crowd I've ever spoken to, so that was kind of news for me. But that's a good example because there was a little bit of pushback leading up to the event, not from the organizers, they invited me, but from some of the people that were seeing who was on their roster. But once I gave the speech, I got tons of great feedback. I think they're afraid that I'm going to go in there and tell them that they're stupid for believing in God. And really, that's not really my point.
Right.
And then I go in there and I just tell them, hey, when you say X, Y, Z, imagine how that sounds to me. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of times they're like, oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Have you or anybody from Secular Pro-Life ever been invited to any atheist conference or gathering or anything like that?
I don't think we were specifically invited. We did go to the American Atheist Convention a couple of years ago. And I didn't personally go, but...
Do you mean just go as attendees, or did you have a booth there or something?
We tabled, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kelsey went along with some of our volunteers, and from what she tells me, they had pretty mixed reactions. They had, every now and then we'll have people come up to us and say, wow, I thought I was the only pro-life atheist, which you can understand how they might think that. Mm-hmm. And then they're excited that we exist. But we also had people who were angry that they let us table at all. And they compare it to, what's next, secularists against gay marriage or pick a cause, right? And so it was controversial. And we had Matt Dillahunty invited one of our members to debate him. I think it was late 2012. And we did, and it's on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So that happened. But for the most part, no. For the most part, it's pretty don't talk and don't acknowledge. Even when other pro-choice atheists do give us a forum occasionally, they usually get a lot of flack about it, too. We're actually on an atheist podcast.
Oh, I know it. I'm well aware.
I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's why I originally contacted you at all, because I was surprised that you covered us, and then I was more surprised that you covered us a second time.
Well, I think it's probably one of the most fascinating things that you hold a stance that I totally disagree with. I don't think that's a surprise for most people, but it is very interesting to me to see a group, why you guys would believe that. That is interesting to me. And then to watch you, like you said, between a rock and a hard place, you can't win no matter what you do. And trying to watch you guys...
accept that?
Right, and trying to watch all of you try to figure out, how do I fit in the Christian world? How do I fit in the atheist world? And I don't think you're going to be able to find a thing. And that to me is just a very interesting story.
Well, so for me, the way it works for me is I accept that the vast majority of pro-choice atheists are not going to accept us, and many religious pro-lifers don't accept us either. And you know what? It is what it is. I'm glad we exist for the secular pro-lifers who are already out there, because when we do have someone contact us, I've had people come up to me at marches. We've had people contact us through our website saying that they're so excited because they really thought they were the only one and they don't feel like they can talk openly about it because of the hostility in most secular circles. I'm glad to give them that venue. And even if we always stayed small, which we, to an extent, we probably will because of what you were talking about, that's okay with me. I'm grateful to have a venue to put these ideas out there. And I never would have anticipated how working with secular pro-life gives me an opportunity to talk to Christians who are genuinely curious to understand us. Because the abortion thing gives us this common ground where it doesn't feel like a religious battle between us. And then through that, I can have conversations with them about how this sounds to us, why this might be off-putting. I did a blog post, I don't know, a couple months ago called The Imago Dei, or Why Secularists Should Care About Human Life. And I was really glad to write it because I've had people come up to me, Christians, come up to me at conferences and basically say, like, I don't really get why you're here or why you care about anything at all. I'm like, they're not trying to be insulting. They're really curious. And so I can write this blog post and the Christians who follow us can read it and think about it without it being this sort of defensive thing. You know what I mean? So I really enjoy that part of it a lot.
I will say this, and again, as Hammond said, like I don't agree with your stance, and it seems unlikely I'd be persuaded without a lot of compelling talking. I will say this, I gotta respect you for standing up for what you believe in, because I think, I don't know, we've all been in the place that we're not the popular opinion as atheists or agnostics, but you know, you clearly have done your research. I just wish, I wish it wasn't a pro-life thing. I wish it was a let's try to reduce the need. And I understand you do that.
You wish it wasn't a restricting abortion thing so much as a educating.
Right. And I think education is so important and access to birth control is so important. But the reality is people make mistakes and birth control fails. And What do you
do when that happens?
Right. I don't foresee a situation where abortions are ever eradicated. That just doesn't seem like a realistic future.
Monica, do you know what percent of we always hear about the rise of the nuns, the people who are religiously unaffiliated. Within that segment, how many people are pro-life? Do you have any idea?
So we don't have access to polls that ask that question of secular or non-religious people specifically, but we do have polls like Gallup polls that talk about, on the one hand, how many Americans refer to themselves as pro-life, and then on the other hand, how many Americans refer to themselves as non-religious. And according to secular pro-life calculations, like the conservative end of it, it would be, Gallup found that at least between 15 and 20% of people who call themselves non-religious also refer to themselves as pro-life. So if we assume 15%, that comes to like 6 million Americans on the lower end.
Jessica's shaking her head because she doesn't believe it. But I've actually seen very similar numbers.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have seen similar numbers.
Yeah.
Actually, the numbers I think that I've seen, and I would have to double check on this, I think they were in the low 20s of people who are non-religious, but again, that includes a lot of people who believe in a higher power.
Yeah.
Who also say they are pro-life or whatever terminology they used.
Yeah, and maybe it wasn't explained in a way that I grasp, but to me, like saying this percentage of people are pro-life and this percentage of people are non-religious and saying, just mash those, I feel like that doesn't account for like the fact that a lot of Christian people are pro-life and
say they're non-religious or something. And for what it's worth, I forgot where I was going with that. It's all good. No, I was going to say for what it's worth, there are a lot of non-religious people who also say they believe in prayer and who believe in angels. And you're like, really? Those don't seem very compatible.
And astrology and all sorts of fun things. Yeah. Well, not only that, but there's also a lot of ambiguity, I think, with the terms pro-life and pro-choice. Everyone on this call is familiar with it because it sounds like all of us have wrestled with this issue. But every now and then, and it's not common just because I work with a pro-life group, but sometimes I'll come across in my life people who are just not involved in the abortion debate at all. Like in any way, it's just not something that's on their radar. And they do not have the same understanding I do of what either of those terms mean, pro-life or pro-choice. So like, if I could design a poll to really sift it out, I would want to find basically all the Americans who are materialists, who think that abortion should be more legally restricted. That's how I would ask the question.
Sure.
But I don't know of any polls that get that specific, so.
Really quick, is it correct that I read a story that excuse me, you were rejected from volunteering at a crisis pregnancy center a while back? Is that true?
That is true. When I lived in San Francisco, before secular pro-life existed, actually, I've always been, like I said, I sort of am predisposed to the more helping with resources and education kind of thing. And so I thought, if I want to do something in the pro-life world, I'd rather be on the end that's trying to help women who don't want to have abortion get the resources they need. And so I thought, well, maybe I can volunteer at a crisis pregnancy center. And I looked up, I don't remember now which one it was, because this is several years ago, but I contacted, I think, the one in San Francisco closest to me, and they were perfectly friendly. There was no reason they would know that I was a secularist, and they just said, sure, we'll send over the forms, and one of them included, a written testament that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior. And I was like, well, that's awkward.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm not going to lie about it, you know, so I actually do know pro-life secularists who have lied about it. They want to help in what way they can, so they just pretend to be Christian so that it's not weird, which I think is kind of weird in itself. But
right.
I do know people who've done that.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the expression, there's no such thing as a moral abortion except for my abortion? Have you ever heard that phrase?
Did you say moral abortion?
There's no such thing. The only moral abortion is my abortion. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that, yeah.
Do you have you encountered that? People who were previously pro-life until they got pregnant, their daughter got pregnant, their sister got pregnant, and all of a sudden, no, you don't get it.
Because a lot of religious people do get abortions in churches, evangelical churches.
And a lot of religious people are pro-choice. I actually think the mainstream pro-life movement, I'm not sure if they're aware of how split it is. Even among self-described Catholics, it's almost half and half.
Mm-hmm. Have you experienced anyone?
I'm sorry?
Have you experienced anybody that you worked with in the pro-life movement who had to have an abortion and then ended up getting it?
I have only known people that had abortions a long time ago and that actually converted them to being pro-life, but I haven't known anyone that I know of that has already been a pro-life activist, gotten an abortion, and then continue to be a pro-life activist. Mm-hmm. They probably exist, but you can see why they probably wouldn't talk about it. And
right.
I personally haven't known anyone. I have known pro-choicers who used to be pro-life, and either they or more often someone they were very close to had to go through this, and it changed their view. Mm-hmm. So I do think that it's very similar to I don't know if this is a good analogy, but you know how a lot of people might be either ambivalent or against gay rights until they become close to someone who's gay.
Sure.
I think there's something to that with this too, especially for pro-lifers who haven't already known someone who's post-abortive. The pro-lifers who do, they might be a little bit more resolute, like they've seen what it looks like and they understand how difficult it can be, and they still hold the position they do. But ones who haven't really made themselves take a really hard look at it, I think like with anything, if you haven't really delved into the strongest objections to your position, then the first time they come up, it's going to be more likely to sway you.
Yeah, I also think that there's sometimes a problem that people who are against abortion can hold this stance because they've never found themselves in that situation, and so people who need abortions are those kind of people, are irresponsible people.
They're not my people.
They're not my people. And I had a friend who...
I think I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm so bad about interrupting.
No, it's totally fine. It's weird over the phone. But it's just a quick anecdote that yikes badikes, that a friend of mine, grabbed me and was like, I missed my period. Will you come with me to get a pregnancy test? And literally from the walk to where we were to picking up the pregnancy test, she was like, oh, I'm sure I'm not pregnant. I would never get an abortion. And within 5 minutes, when she found out she was in fact pregnant, she was like, all right, so Planned Parenthood right now, right? I think
she changed her mind just like that.
It's very easy to say I would never get an abortion
Until it happens to you.
Until it happens to you, and I don't know, your situation is different from everybody else's.
Yeah, and I think, if nothing else, I think that should demonstrate that even for people who remain pro-life in those situations, we should be very, very reserved in judgment. I think that a lot of women, it's hard to understand what they're going through, and actually it's not a very. It's also controversy within the pro-life movement. There's a huge faction that's basically like, we shouldn't judge, we should just help. And then there's a huge faction that's like, well, if it's the same thing as a baby, then of course we should judge. And they argue amongst themselves about that. But I think that even if a given pro-lifer believes it's the same as a newborn, they should be able to recognize that the woman in that situation doesn't. And that makes a big difference. But I also wanted to say that the flip side I've seen happen too, where someone was pro-choice and then they had an abortion that negatively affected them far more than they thought it would, and or they had an abortion that didn't really affect them that badly, but then they had a wanted pregnancy and they went through the ultrasounds and all of that, and that changed them to being pro-life. So I think people can go through either transition, and that's why I like to seek out the opinions of people well, especially women who've already been pregnant, one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So at least they've gone through that.
Actually, that's not an unfair point, that there's two sides of that coin. You're right.
I was going to say, we're closing up here, but we're like, I want to wish you luck, but I really don't, because I don't want you to succeed. But I like you, and I hope...
With the secular religious understanding part.
Yes, and I appreciate that you're willing to have this conversation with us. Was this a fair conversation?
Oh, yeah, I
awesome.
think so.
I'm sorry.
I don't need you guys to... We don't have to agree.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking your time and being willing to talk about a really tough subject. So thank you so much, Monica, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Monica.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. This episode was taped at Cinnamon Sound Studios in Aurora, Illinois, and the music was written and performed by Brad Chagdis. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a contribution at patreon.com/Hemant, that's He-Man T. We appreciate your support. I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke. We hope you'll join us next time.